Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome if you're Muslim. Hi, if you're not Muslim. Welcome to today's conversation. Thank you for spending your Friday evening or night, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Rahimeh Ramezany. I'm a diversity, equity, inclusion, intercultural practitioner, specifically looking at how Muslims and other religious minorities can be included within DEI work. Hey, salam, deportee. And today we are hosting a conversation around anti-Black racism within the Muslim community, and I am joined by a very special guest, Maliha. Hey, salam, Hannah. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Hannah is a friend from LinkedIn and a fellow DEI practitioner who is also equally amazing. Maliha, you guys should really connect as well. Aside from that, Maliha is our special guest today for us to both have this conversation together, so you don't just see me like talking at you all about this topic, which would be very awkward for me and probably like a little bit weird on your guys' end too. So I'll let Maliha introduce herself and then we'll get started.
Thank you so much for having me, Rahimeh. This is so nice of you to organize. Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Maliha. I am a Muslim person. My background is like in mental health. I'm a public health worker. I also go to grad school for social policy. And I'm interested in this conversation because I think it's like super important within the Muslim community, especially those of us who are like non-Black Muslims. It is even more important for us to have that conversation and hold our fellow siblings in Islam accountable. And also like, collective community levels and how we could do better by our Black brothers and sisters,
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. And I will name also, hey, and I want to say, walaikum salam to Kay. Thank you so much, for your very kind comment. To name the elephant in the room, or I don't know, like what may or may not be obvious is that Maliha and I are both not Black, right?
Right.
And so the idea being is that anti-Black racism, whether in Muslim spaces or in non-Muslim spaces, because I work in both like spaces, obviously. As a Muslim, I'm in my own community spaces, and then also in my professional work doing DEI, I'm predominantly working with non-Muslim organizations. So I've seen these conversations about anti-Black racism and the needs to address it and deconstruct it and all the things in both of those contexts. And what is clear and very much the foundation of all of this work is that it is a non-Black person's issue. We are the ones who have internalized racism that we then interpersonally, intrapersonally, systemically put and make a problem to our Black siblings in faith as Muslims or Black siblings in humanity. That's just the language that I like, because for me, I like the analogy of like human beings being a family. People, I would assume, have siblings. If you're a single child, hopefully this still analogy makes sense. But the idea being like, if you have siblings that you might mess with them, you might argue with them, especially like if we're all adults, assuming that we're all adults here. I think I changed the settings on the live so that people under 18, or at least on their accounts, they can't log in, just because TikTok has a weird thing with like 13-year-olds leaving really bizarre comments on stuff. I'm like, yeah, I just don't want to deal with that. But anyway, side note, the point being, like, as a family, like you have presumably two parents, and let's say you have three children, and if you're all adults, like you might bicker, you might have like family history to work through, but externally, if someone messes with your sibling, says something derogatory to someone in your family, you are probably going to stick up for them, and you can say those kinds of things to your sibling, but no one else better do that, right? And so something that I really appreciate looking at, like, yes, we have different races, we have different ethnicities, and from a Muslim perspective, we believe that like we have Quran verses that say, and I just want to be very clear that I am not an Islamic scholar, okay? Like, understand, I say this in many of my videos, I will continue to do so, because like I'm not an Islamic scholar, but like just from being Muslim and understanding the faith, like to the very elementary level that I am, I'm a very imperfect Muslim myself. Inshallah, I'll continue to grow and be better overall. Oh, looks like someone needs to get blocked. Sweet. Okay. Thanks, Hannah, for calling that out. Okay, so what was I saying? ADHD just got Maliha, you take over. What was I saying?
Yeah, no, we were talking about how within our own community, it reminded me of our prophet saying, like,
Yeah.
when we're part of one big ummah, and if one part of the body hurts, the entire ummah hurts, right? So if one community is facing injustice, then the entire community is hurting, right? Like, justice is not like it's not something an individual experience, it's a collective experience. And so when we talk about anti-Black racism within the Muslim community, and also I just want to also clarify, I think both of us have an American lens, so we are talking more within like America or like the Western Muslim world in general, and we're like, I'm sure there's like nuances in the conversation of how this looks back
for sure
in different parts of the world, right? So just wanted to put that out there that
Absolutely.
This is an American-centric conversation when it comes to anti-Black racism within the Muslim people, the Muslim world in the States. But yeah, no, 100%. I think it's I think starting with like naming the issue, because so many times whenever there's this conversation about anti-Black racism, people are like, oh, but Bilal radiallahu anhu, right? Like they use so many cop-out language instead of recognizing like, okay, or people also have this thing where like, well, we are not like white people or whatever, right? And it's like,
but are you?
Oppression isn't linear, right? Like just because somebody else did it worse doesn't give you a cop out like, oh, I'm not as bad as the others, right? It's like recognizing that we all have a role to play, small or big, and doing what our responsibility is to reflect on that, become aware. And also, how do we assist somebody? Even if you are not doing the oppression, you have a role of alleviating somebody else's injustice, right? And so how do we as a Muslim community recognize within our community how our Black siblings are being treated? How can we do better? And even if you think you don't have issues with that, is recognizing that the Black community in the US is struggling with so many injustices, and it is our duty as their fellow siblings in faith to show up for them.
Right? They are our community. These things, police brutality and school to prison pipeline and maternal death rates and a million other examples of the 100%. Issues that because of white supremacy, because of anti-Black racism, Black folks in this country and across the world as well deal with, is because of people who are not Black dealing with members of the Black community in that way. And that part of that Black community is us, is our community as well. There's that intersectional lens to it. I remembered where I was going with my other points about the Quran, so I'm going to go back to that. Anyone who has ADHD, like, we all understand where this is all going for, which is awesome. Like, and honestly, this is on TikTok, which is amazing. If I were on like LinkedIn, I'd have to be like, oh, I'm more put together and all that, which we're not on LinkedIn. So anyway, the idea being like, that like from an Islamic perspective, right, there are so many verses of the Quran that talk about like how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created humankind with diversity. We made your colors and people's different, your language is different, and we made it so that, not me, like obviously like paraphrasing the Quran, right, that Allah has told us to go and get to know other people, to go and see that the diversity of his creation, and not just human beings, but also like the plants and the animals and the landscape and all of the things, this is part of the signs of God and of his miracles, right? And so the idea is like, and when I do videos on anti-Black racism amongst the other topics that I talk about on my different like media channels, I get so many comments from non-Black Muslims like, well, racism is haram in Islam, right? For the non-Muslims who might be here, haram just means forbidden, right? Oh, well, racism is haram. So I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, I agree. But you can't use that kind of logic on literally anything else for it to make sense. So it's really like, it shows that it is really a bad faith comment, because if we talk about like, oh, well, you have to do your 5 daily prayers. Does that mean that everyone does their 5 daily prayers? No.
Exactly.
Does that mean like alcohol is generally accepted across most of Islam, that is not acceptable to consume? Does that mean that there are Muslims who consume alcohol? Of course there are. Right. Like people who steal, people who lie, people like all these things that also Islam very much says like, okay, you're not supposed to do those things. And yet we all know Muslims who do that, or sometimes we ourselves do them.
Yeah. And also, like, when people like racism is haram, okay, then uphold it. right? Like, why are you using that
Yeah.
to
Then you
defend
should be
someone?
offended. Like
You should
all of,
be
and especially like on
exactly.
TikTok, all these like haram police and people like wanting to police other Muslims about their behavior and what they're doing. And like for some reason, like for instance, like a lot of Muslim men are just like obsessed with like policing Muslim women's hijab and, oh, they're not wearing hijab correctly or not enough or the colors. Most recently on TikTok, there was this whole thing about like Muslim men, bro, halal bros, or whatever the term they came up for themselves, or that we're like calling them for them. Like, oh, sisters, like you shouldn't have your face on, social media because that might
Oh
be
my God. Yeah.
misused. And it's like, okay, everything is about pointing to the person, in this case, right, women, talking to the people who are victims of abuse, victims of people's bad intentions, and saying, you need to be less. You need to handle other people being bad instead
Hmm.
of addressing, in this case, men, brothers, teaching other brothers, like, hey, we're going to call you out for being problematic, for being sexist, for being misogynist, blah, 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 blah. Right. And so,
Hmm.
and it's
Hmm.
funny because I'm also on a lot of like non-Muslim on TikTok. I get a lot of like non-Muslim intersectional feminism or not
Hmm.
so intersectional feminism content. And I really do appreciate learning from those videos. However, so much of what I see, especially from women, like white women's videos, is literally carbon copy the kind of talking points that I've seen Black folks talk about when they talk
Mm.
about racism. And
Yeah.
yet, for
Yeah.
some reason, those same white people, like, especially like white women, when
Don't
the
agree.
conversation was about them experiencing misogyny and sexism, they were with it. They were having such really great points and sticking to critical thinking and all that. But then as soon as it comes to a Black person pointing out literally the same talking points, but just talking about race, it's like all of a sudden like, oh, you're attacking me. And like now they're parroting the same things that white men are telling
Yeah.
white women about misogyny. It's like, do you literally not see it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. I think, and I've reflected on this a lot as well, like within the Muslim community, right? Like we do face oppression within the US, right? People face Islamophobia, xenophobia, there's job discrimination, there's hijab discrimination. But when we have the conversation of Black Muslims experiencing racism within the mosques or schools or whatever, like Islamic schools, then they're like, no, 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 we're all brothers and sisters. But I'm like, you have the experience of oppression, you understand what it looks like. But
Mm,
when your fellow Black Muslims are naming the kind of oppression they're experiencing,
mm.
then you are like, oh, but it's different, right? But it's not. Like, you
No.
have the capacity to understand
Yeah.
these, like, social, oppressive, like, culture or whatever.
Mm,
So 100%. And I think you talking about hijab reminded me of how, even within hijab, right? Like, we have, like, um, the hijab styles,
yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
what is considered a more appropriate or religious hijab
Yeah.
style? Often again we see that anti-Blackness there because certain hijab
Ugh,
styles are more
always.
common in different parts of the world, right? Like
Mm,
the way Arabs wear their hijabs are different than the South Asians wearing their hijab, different than Africans wearing their
mm,
hijab, right? And so it's like when we put a hierarchy, which I think that itself is a problem, like having a hierarchy of what is a better hijab, but then there is that cultural element of like what culture's hijab do we put higher and what
mm,
culture, and
mm.
often there's discrimination particularly against like turban style hijabs or head wraps and things like that, right?
Yeah.
People are like, oh, that's not proper hijab, but it's like there is an undertone of anti-Blackness there where it's like those are the standardized hijabs in certain communities of within the Muslim group, right?
Mm, mm.
Certain ethnic groups do that kind of hijab. So when you alienate them saying that is not good hijab, you are essentially saying that they're not good enough Muslims, or you're like
Mm, mm,
gatekeeping
mm.
um your Muslimness in a way. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And
Yeah.
so I think like hijab is a big one on how like misogyny and racism comes into play
Yeah.
within Muslim community, right? Like
Yeah.
misogynoir. And I think that's interesting within like the fashion element within the abaya company, whatever, like Muslim modest, the
Yeah.
modest fashion
Yeah.
industry. Also like how we police bodies, I think, on the topic of hijab, right? Like,
Yeah.
because different cultures, different outfits, and what is considered appropriate or not appropriate often has the undertone of like different body types, right?
Mm,
Like if you have a
mm.
curvier body, you are considered not wearing hijab appropriately, which we also know, and this is again from US history, right? Like
Yeah.
um fat phobia is rooted in anti-blackness as well.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so it's important for Muslims to reflect on these things, right?
yeah.
I'm not saying like, oh, Muslims are completely at fault for everything, but it's like it
No,
is
of
our
course not.
responsibility to do the work of how these racist undertones, right? Like through white supremacy, through colonization, we've
Mm-hmm.
learned to hate our own selves. We've learned to hate other communities because of colonization. And so it's so important for us to sit down, do that reflection, especially
Yeah,
when other people are holding us accountable. They're calling us in. They're like, hey, that's kind of racist. Like it's hurting me. And I'm like your sibling, right?
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
why not sit and do that reflective work on recognizing how we're promoting already existing harmful ideas, and
yeah.
we become like a tool in furthering that oppression, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I get very frustrated when I'm around Muslims, which I'm around a number of Muslims like this in my personal life.
Mm-hmm.
And online I've come across that as well. Like this kind of perception that our community is just like isolated
Mm-hmm.
in from like again we're in the United States context, like from the Western world around us, and we are not ever influenced by what's going on around us, and that doesn't change our thinking. Whereas like for me, I know that I am a Muslim American, that my way of practicing Islam, my way of thinking about Islam and all of that is very much affected by how I was born and raised in this culture,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that is going to be the norm for people who grow up in Arab countries, who grow up in Desi countries, who grow up in African Muslim countries, and other anywhere else in the world. Like, of course, and there is space within Islam for halal, right? For the non-Muslims, like permissible, just
You're right.
halal ways of showing your own ethnic, racial, national, whatever cultures, right? Like we can wear different styles of hijab, we can wear different styles of clothing, we can live our lives in various different ways as long as it still doesn't fall outside of the realm of what is Islamically acceptable and not acceptable. However, there's so much leeway for people to just be who they are. Like Islam is not meant,
Exactly.
like
Mm-hmm.
any Muslims watching, like like we've all been taught this. Islam did not come to like end our lives and we're all meant to be monks and we're all meant to just pray all the time and fast all the time and literally never have any fun. How much has have we learned about how the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the people around him were so emphasizing about smiling and joking and uplifting the spirits of the people around you and being like a balm to them and a shelter to them and a mercy to other people. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, came as a mercy
Yeah,
to the other people, right? Like, so in
absolutely.
all these things, and like for me, I am so moved by the fact like Allah himself, like tells Muslim to start everything by invoking his mercy and his compassion. Why is it
Mm-hmm.
like mercy and compassion, when you think about it, like compared to all of the qualities of Allah, like those are like two pretty similar ones, right? Like we could get into the nitty gritty of like differences, and like they're not the exact the same thing. I'm not saying that, but like generally, like they're very similar. Like why
Right.
not compassion and justice? Why not compassion and generosity? Why not like
Mm-hmm.
other slightly different thing, like compassion and mercy is something that we are meant to invoke so many times in front of everything that we do, and yet we treat each other, fellow Muslims, with such harshness and such judgment and racism and ethnocentricity and colorism and sexism, on and all these things. And then, of course, we're also not supposed to treat other human beings that way, our siblings in humanity, who are also justified in, no, sorry, not justified. Let me rephrase that. Who are also dignified in the way that they live, and as creations of Allah are just as much worthy of our respect and being treated with dignity. And just the same as like nature and trees and bushes and flowers and plants and animals are also meant as the creation of Allah to be treated with dignity and respect. So this idea of like, again, like using, like you said, Bilal as an example of like, oh, we had this one person, I'm like, okay, yeah, true. And does that
Yeah.
mean that your actions then therefore like aren't reflective of what you're actually doing? Does that like Islam saying that racism is not allowed, but then you are committing racism, so you should be concerned. Like I don't understand why I'm
Exactly.
having to persuade you that what you're doing, like because you know that racism is not allowed and what you're doing is racist, but then you're not concerned, like for the Muslims here, right? Like, yeah, exactly, Hannah. Like below is like very much
Oh yeah,
used
the
as a
Muslim.
token from
Mm-hmm.
non-black Muslims, right? Like, yeah, it's gone to the point of being a very problematic experience and very dismissive. But just the
Mm-hmm.
idea that, like, do you really want, as fellow Muslims, like, to be going to the Day of Judgment with your book of deeds filled with all the like microaggressions and racist actions that you did? Is that
Yeah.
something you feel comfortable? And we
Mm-hmm.
like in Islam, like we're encouraged to constantly remember death, to constantly remember that, like, to seek forgiveness at night, because we don't know if the next morning is not guaranteed to us. In the mornings, to seek forgiveness and be the best person that we can be and do all of our duties and all of that, because we don't know, and our evenings are not guaranteed to us, and all the things that were taught in other factors, like, apply this to, you are being racist towards whole classes of our community, and you are comfortable just going to your Day of Judgment and carrying your book of deeds, and that's going to be filled in your book. I wouldn't be comfortable with that.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, no, absolutely. These are um such important points and reminders, both for ourselves and also for our community, right?
Mm,
Like when you bring up these things like, oh, Bilal radiallahu anhu, or racism is haram, it's like, yeah, but are you upholding it?
yeah.
Are you upholding it? Are you doing the day-to-day work to uphold the very things that the
Mm,
Prophet told us about and reminding us? Yeah, and another thing I think in so the Muslim communities need, okay, specifically the immigrant Arab Desi Muslim community
mm, mm,
need to acknowledge how much they owe, in the sense of, like, like we talked about
mm,
the civil rights, also just like, even like not just Black community but the indigenous community, right? Like we are settlers in America, and
mm,
again, obviously there's a lot of reasons, and I'm not saying it's like, oh, a bad thing, but it's like, given, whether it's war, economic reasons, whatever,
mm,
to
mm,
acknowledge, right, to acknowledge the communities that already exist here before we got here. Like, and when I say we, I'm an immigrant myself, right?
mm, mm.
And acknowledging and recognizing and connecting with that community, because I feel like sometimes there is like that, we're not as connected to the Black community in
Mm,
general. I
mm.
don't just mean the Black Muslim community, but like sometimes there is like isolation, right? And it's
Yeah.
so important to be connecting with other communities of color within the US to form bonds, like
Mm,
Islam says, right? Like, we created you of I forget the ayah, of different like tribes and
yeah.
nationalities,
Yeah.
so you might
Yeah. Yeah.
know each other. And
Yeah.
there's a reason that is Allah Himself encouraging
Mm, mm.
community building, and um forming.
Taking the proactive steps to get to know other people, not just like, oh, okay, they're over there, and like, okay, that's fine.
Yeah, yeah, no, 100%. So I think it's so important for us on a collective level to put that effort to recognize our position within the US world, like within American society, and how we have to connect. Thank you, Hannah, for bringing that up. Can we talk about the model
Yeah.
minority myth and
Yeah.
assimilation to whiteness? Yes, assimilation to whiteness is so important, because I do recognize that so many times, as immigrant parents, like, they will encourage us, like, behaviors of, like, you want to do well in school, get to corporate America, get the job,
Mm,
right? Like, we do want to be more white in that sense of being more
mm,
successful, but they don't necessarily reflect or have the same attitudes when it comes to connecting with the Black community, right? And
mm,
100%, like, that's another way they're perpetuating that anti-Black racism within our community. And I do want to acknowledge that, at least within the US, right? I'm South Asian, right? Like, I know Asian Americans have a lot of privileges in terms of like career success and things like that. And the model minority myth, which, within the US they promote, like, I like to use the word, they allow Asian Americans to gain success, because then they like pit us against each other.
yeah,
Like, they pit us
exactly.
against each other. They're like, wow, look at these immigrants that came here with nothing, and they're able to like get good jobs and get houses
Yeah.
and stuff. And then
So what's your problem?
yeah, so why can't you all do it? You've been here for generations. You're always complaining, da 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 da. But it's again a reminder to the Asian community that this is a tool where we are being weaponized, our identities are being weaponized, and our life experience being weaponized to harm the Black community, right? Because not that you guys didn't work hard, right? Because a lot of times when you talk about the model minorities, they're like, well, we did work hard for what you did. But the thing is, you didn't have barriers, right? They did not hit us with mass incarceration. They didn't hit us with like the war on drugs and things like that, right? Like, I feel like recognizing, even if our hard work was rewarded, other people also worked hard, but they were disrupted, right? They didn't have barriers when they were applying for housing or loans, right? Like, sorry, not they. So we didn't have, like, as Asians, we didn't, we're able to own homes. We're able to form, do a lot of these social mobility things to gain higher salaries, properties, and assets without the bank being suspicious of us, without them denying things, right? But if you're a Black person, you are having those barriers that the Asian person is not having. And so it's important for us Muslims. I know there is an overlap, right? Intersectionality exists, but a lot of like the Muslim immigrant community fall under the Asian or the
like right now we are talking about as non-Black Muslims ourselves, you, like as non-Black Muslims ourselves, we are talking to our fellow non-Black Muslims, right? So there's always going to be like a complete recognition that there is a huge number of Black Muslims, whether they are Africans in Africa, whether they live in other parts of the diaspora, whether they are African American, right? Like ISPU, the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, which is a like think tank research nonprofit in the United States. They did a study, I forget the exact number, but about 30% of the Muslims in the United States and the largest chunk of Muslims in the United States are Black, right? So like, just so everyone is clear, like there's a huge percentage of Black Muslims, African Muslims, Caribbean Muslims, right? Like from different ethnic and national identities that all fall under like the umbrella racially as Black, right? Racism, the social contract, all the things. However, this conversation is about like non-Black Muslims coming to conversations of anti-Black racism because it is our problem to address because we're the ones doing it, right? So just to speak to your point, Maliha.
No, thank you. Absolutely. Yeah. So when it comes like to the model minority myth, like we all, as non-Black Muslims, a lot of us benefit from that, right? We benefit from the model minority myth. We have been pitted against. And I think it's so important to recognize that it's not like a good thing for white people, for like white supremacy or whiteness to kind of give us like these privileges because they're giving it us as a cost of harming somebody else, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's important for our communities to have these conversations and recognize and also use our privilege, right? So, okay.
Absolutely,
given this pathway of model minority. You're given this pathway of whether it's income or assets, like how can we build solidarity? How can we do mutual aid? How can we uplift and ourselves recognize the common issue, which is racism, and the common issue of white supremacy, and work with Black Muslims and Black people in general towards led liberation where we don't have to be pitted against each other because there is enough resources for all of us.
Yeah. And especially from a Muslim perspective, right? Yeah. Like, sorry, well, hang on.
Go ahead. Yeah, that's it.
No, from a Muslim so like, again, so I work in my DEI work, I work predominantly like 99.99% with non-Muslims. So I can talk about scarcity versus abundance mindset from like a secular perspective with non-Muslims. But for any Muslims who may have heard of the, scarcity versus abundance mindset, for me, I learned about like that terminology from a non-Muslim perspective, but I find it to be incredibly Islamic because the idea being from a Muslim perspective is that everything is from Allah, from this one creator who has control over all things, who has control over all of our risk, and could give anything and any amount to anyone. And there's never going to be a time where Allah runs out of things, benefits, blessings to give to any one person, right? And so the idea being is that we need to deconstruct this competitive way of looking at each other and our own ethnic groups. And we know from an Islamic perspective, right, like the Prophet, peace be upon him, came to the Arabs because they were so tribalistic and fighting each other and killing each other over things that really like didn't matter because it was just like, oh, my group is better than your group and let's like beat each other out for resources. That's a very like surface level, again, not a scholar. Please go and learn Islamic history if you're really interested in that. But like certainly like a very short abbreviated version. The idea being, right, like
The
in
scarcity
Islam, we
mindset.
believe like
Yeah.
Allah has creation over, or has dominance over all of creation, all blessings and all avenues of financial, benefits. I'm so, I
No,
am
you're
stuttering
good. You're
so much
doing
today.
great.
My goodness. Let's not
Yeah.
do this
And I
on a
mean,
Friday
these are,
afternoon. But anyway, Allah is in control of everything. There's no reason why He couldn't give you, your family, and every Muslim and every person in the world anything and any amount. And so there is no point in us fighting each other for it. If we as Muslims really do believe that all of this is from Allah, if we really do believe that, then we need to reflect that in our actions.
right. And also like recognizing that the scarcity mindset is also engineered within the US to have
Yeah.
marginalized people fight over them,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
like
that,
those of us at the bottom, like from a marginalized perspective, not like
right,
inherently that we're inferior, but like again, the
right.
system of
So
white supremacy has
creating
placed us at the
scarcity,
bottom. Like we're
exactly.
fighting each other while the top are just like watching us. If anything, they're just like ignoring us and like
Yeah.
rolling around in their money and sending rockets to Mars for the fun of it.
100%, 100%. Because I think it's so, okay, so I think like, for example, the Muslim immigrant community recognizes the harms of the US military
Mm.
and the way they're like bombing the Middle East or, Central Asia, like so many countries, you know what I'm talking about, right? And we recognize the
No,
harm.
what are you talking about? I'm not familiar.
Right? So when they're doing that,
Yeah.
they're genuinely harming, and us, our community, the immigrant Muslim community, we recognize it, we talk about it,
Mm.
and we can use that to build solidarity with other marginalized communities in the US, right? Like Black people are experiencing political brutality literally in their homes, right? This is where they live, this is their homes, and they're also experiencing the harms of a militarized state. And so instead of like competing, instead of being like, you don't get my problem, it's like recognizing that white supremacy and American like capitalism, whatever, is harming all of us in different ways and keeping us in that scarcity mindset, keeping us hurting. And so we can come together to fight the bigger oppressor. But a part of it is we have to fight our inner oppression, right? Like that internalized racism, so that we can build community, so that we can look out for each other, right? And this begins on, like, obviously these are more macro level issues, which is important to talk about, but it begins in our mosques, right?
Yeah.
It begins in the attitudes that we have within our community centers, our mosques during Ramadan,
Islamic schools,
right?
like,
Within these spaces or within your own neighborhoods and things like that, right? Like recognizing and building that solidarity and understanding that we're all struggling in different ways. Like racism is affecting all of us in different ways. So it doesn't help when we participate in it ourselves. Like like immigrant Muslims have experienced racism, right? Especially if you're like Desi or Arab. And then we also perpetuate anti-Black racism, right? And so it's like, hey guys, you know what it's like to be on the receiving end of this. So why are we choosing to do it else, right?
That's what drives me crazy when talking to Muslims or other marginalized groups, right? I was talking about women in general, or white women, earlier on in the conversation. And like, yes, white women are still white, but they do experience misogyny and sexism. And yet when they are talking about their experiences to men, they are like very critical thinking. Their arguments are set, packed, like very thought out, amazing. But then the second it turns to like using those same arguments for like how they perpetuate harm, all of a sudden like they just can't seem to wrap their hand around it. And the same thing that I see for so many Muslims. If you are Muslim in the West, you pretty much 99% chance that you have experienced Islamophobia to some extent, whether it's institutional or systemic, whether it's interpersonal, someone said something to you, someone's yelled at you. I've been yelled out from a car driving by me. I've had stuff said to me in grocery stores before. Like we've all, like if we've gone on an airplane or we've gone in, past TSA, like Muslims have experienced the things, like we've experienced what we've had to in the West. And so the idea that for some reason, if you as a brown person, or, you know, I don't necessarily identify as brown, like that's like whole complicated, but just like as a Muslim, like being visibly identifiable as Muslim, having a Muslim name, whatever, like someone codes you as Muslim and they treat you as such in a biased manner, you have experienced that, you know what it's like. And yet when others come to you and say, hey, you are also doing things that are similar in causing harm, you feel offended when others ignore
Yeah,
you when you
yeah,
call
yeah.
for just treatment, but then you're just going to ignore it. How are you any
Mhm,
better than
mhm.
anyone else that you're criticizing for treating you Islamophobically? You're
Yeah,
not.
yeah, 1,000,000%. Yeah, 100%. Um, Another thing I think Hannah mentioned, East African, South Asian diaspora, unpacking how colonialism played such a big part. Oh my God, yes, right? Like, I think my introduction to racism before racism was colorism, right?
Mm,
So I
mm,
grew up, I am Bengali, like I'm South Asian, but I grew up in the Middle East. I'm like a
mm,
little all over the place, right? But people around me were, I went to an Indian school, like everyone around me was Desi. So it wasn't racism, right? Because
mm,
everyone's
mm,
like more or less the same ethnic group, but it is like we do have colorism huge in
for
South
sure.
Asia, right? And so that was my, I guess, like intro to judging people based on skin color was how dark are they, how light. Like I was
Mm,
considered, because I'm light skinned, I'm like given more compliments and I'm pretty.
mm,
My brother, on
mm,
the other hand, my brother's much darker than me.
mm.
Um, like he often passes as like Latino, like Afro Latino, like a Dominican. Like he's much
Okay.
darker than me, right? So, um, so in my own household, in my own like extended
Mm,
family, or how people perceived me, my brother, like the kind of comments, like I learned from a young age that, oh, his skin color is considered dirty or darker. Like those were the words
yeah.
people would use, right? And so, I mean, obviously, as a kid, you're just like, oh, okay, like I'm not like making a judgment. I'm just like
Yeah, yeah, you're just
talking,
absorbing.
right? But for sure, like these were issues that are rooted in our community, even within people, right? Within community, the whole idea of colorism is so
Mm, mm,
harmful. And that also is a symptom of a bigger issue of racism and
mm,
so on, right? And so for South Asians to recognize like how we perpetuate that those like beauty ideals,
mm,
right?
mm, mm.
And this also reflects on when it comes to like marriage and things like that, on how who is considered like pretty enough to get married or not. And I'm sure we've talked about how people respond to
Yeah.
interracial marriages within the Muslim community at
Mm,
large in the
mm.
US, right? Like generally speaking, Muslims have, I think, even like a higher rate of interracial marriage compared to other groups.
Really?
Yeah, I
Oh,
believe.
interesting.
Yeah, so I can look this up for you, but I don't know
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, I'd be
But
very
we have
interested to
like
hear that.
higher rates of interracial marriages in the Muslim faith community compared to other faith communities. But also at the same time, there is definitely like more stigma when it comes to
Mm,
marrying somebody of a darker skin tone, whether
mm.
because of colorism or racism. Like, and how that shows up is
Or
different,
both.
or both, exactly.
Two for the price of one.
Yeah, 100%, right? So 100%, like these are things for our communities to sit down, think about, and at the
Mm.
very least, like acknowledge. Like I think I
Yeah, like
like it's one
start
thing,
working through it.
like stop being defensive. Stop being defensive. Like you can be like, damn, yeah, we made this just acknowledge like we got parts of us that are not good or perfect, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Like we can work
Every
through it.
human being is like that. Every single person.
Exactly.
Like,
Like, yeah, like I always tell people racism is not a binary. It's not like you are racist or you're not
mm,
racist, right? Like we all have a little bit of racism, a little bit of sexism, homophobia, whatever. And it's important to recognize those parts of ourselves and work on it every single day.
mm,
Okay? Like
mm.
the goal is to be a little racist tomorrow because the
It's
reality is
like unlearning, right?
it's
Like
about
if you
unlearning.
learned racism, you learned sexism as a
Exactly.
child, you as an adult now are capable, if you choose to
Yeah.
unlearn it. It's going to take work. It's going to take time. It's going to be uncomfortable, but you have done uncomfortable things before. You are probably doing
Exactly.
uncomfortable things in your daily life now.
Yeah.
If you value what you're doing, you are fine with putting up with discomfort if you
Yeah.
think that the price is worth it. All of these things, it's just a matter of like, you don't think it's worth it. You feel like it's better to ignore it. And again, seeing that we're talking about this from an Islamic perspective, whether you want to talk it from a religious perspective, right? About whether like Islamically you want to go before your Lord on the day of judgment and you want your book of deeds to be filled with racism, if you feel comfortable with that, then okay, I don't really have anything to say to you about it. But from a religious perspective, if you're like, that doesn't quite sit right, okay, we believe, again, from an Islamic perspective, that as long as we are still breathing, as long as Allah has left us on this plane to continue to improve and strive, I'm not going to say the word because I don't know how TikTok is going to like flag the word, right? And someone I saw in the comments like tag the CIA and FBI. Like, come on, guys. Like, we know the FBI is like has always been on my phone. Like, I know it. I know. Like, you don't need to tag them. Like, they're already here.
Yeah, they're already here. Like, please welcome.
Like, don't worry. Like, don't take the effort on yourself. Like, they're already here, right? So aside from that, like, so I'm not gonna say the word, but hopefully, like, the Muslims understand what I'm talking about, right?
Right, like the inner struggle,
like the struggle to be a better person. Like, you know the word, you know the word I'm talking about, right? Like we're trying to strive. The point is not perfection, right? Islam is not a perfectionist religion. It's about striving to do better, to ask forgiveness. One of my favorite hadiths of multiple of them, one of my favorite hadiths is that Allah would not have taught us Muslims or anyone to seek his forgiveness if he did not want to forgive us. Right? Like just the idea that, and like we know, right? Like Allah is looking for any little excuse to seek, like to show you forgiveness, right? So all these things that we learn about other sins or other things that we need to improve upon, strive upon to be better and all that, applying to this. Okay, seek forgiveness for the things you've done wrong, try to be better, be open to feedback, just as we know, like enjoining good and forbidding evil is something that is a core part of Islam, and something that, like, when you do it right with respect and humility and kindness to your fellow siblings in faith, right? Like that is such an amazing tool for us to collectively uplift each other. Okay, apply this. Like, you should be receptive that if someone comes and tell you like, hey, you're doing your wudu like incorrectly, and they're correct and they're doing it in a kind way that's like protecting your pride and protecting, you know, your dignity, like that should be something that you are receptive to. Okay, then you should be receptive when someone comes to you, whether it is like a fellow Muslim of your same ethnic racial identity, or it is a Black Muslim who's coming and telling you, hey, just so you know, what you said is racist. You need to be open to that feedback.
Yeah, no, 100%. Thank you for that. That is so true. Like, it is in like the way we live as Muslims, it is so important to recognize these things, right? In terms of like how Allah himself is reflection. Our Prophet has done so much reflection, right? Yeah. Remember, like he literally went to a cave. Reflecting is such an important part of Islam. And so that's all we're asking, right? When it comes to the issues of oppression, racism, and things, it's like reflecting on our mannerisms, reflecting on our behaviors, reflecting on the choice of language, right? Especially like I growing up in New York, so many, especially brown men, like Muslim men, a lot of young Muslim men who are non-Black will use like the N-word and things like that. And so many people like call them out and be like, hey, it's not okay. And they're just like, yeah, but like my Black friend said it's okay to use it. So da 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 da. But like these are things that are sinful, right? Like if you are thinking about your Lord, and
what language? In general.
Those are things that will be in your record.
Yeah, like all of our body parts are going to testify against us. Our feet are going to testify about where we told them to take us. Our tongue is going to testify about what words we used our tongue to say. Are you really comfortable when you think it? Like, if you really believe in Islam, in the Quran, that you believe in the Day of Judgment, which to be Muslim, you have to believe in these things. Okay? So if we're all on the same page that we believe in our heart of hearts that these are things are going to happen, are you really comfortable not seeking forgiveness, not trying to change your actions and behaviors? Again, not as like Allah, and we should not expect each other to be perfect. So again, that's not the expectation. I wanted to try and be better.
I wanted to quickly acknowledge a comment. Flora wrote, "Talk about racism and religion here in Saudi. It's too much, sister." I'm sorry to hear that, like your experience. But I do want to acknowledge that we're kind of focusing more on the America or like the West in general, because we're both living in America and that's our experience of racism, or like, you know, to acknowledge, of course, there's racism everywhere, all over the Muslim world, all over the world in general. but kind of just want to reiterate that this conversation is more about the US.
Yeah, and exactly. Like, there are so many other countries and spaces that need to be having these conversations. And it's interesting because a video I did on TikTok specifically recently on anti-Black racism was talking about like how anti-Black racism is a worldwide issue, because I had
Oh, yeah.
a Muslim sister who, from her profile photo, like wears hijab, who she identified herself as Egyptian, and was like commenting on a previous video that I then replied to her with this video, saying like, oh, this is like an American issue. Like, this is in the West. It's really not that
Mm,
bad in like
mm, mm,
Muslim
mm, mm.
countries. And I'm like,
Oh my
what?
God. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
like, again, and this is not from the perspective of like me having experienced it, because obviously I am not Black. I will be favored by colorist standards, not because I'm like good or like good in any way that is something that I've achieved or something about my character. It's literally just because of under white supremacy, like they favor paler skin and I have like hazel eyes and all of that. So that's privilege that I have for literally no reason. And so for her, who, you know, from her profile picture, she also looked like fairly pale skinned as well, like not Muslim, Egyptian, or sorry, not Muslim,
Right.
non-Black. Like, we don't get to say whether Black
Yes.
people have experienced racism in other spaces or not. And the only reason I am saying that they have is because I have spent years listening to both Black non-Muslims and Black Muslims express over and 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 over in a million different contexts and a million different channels how they have experienced anti-Black racism in all parts of the world, unfortunately, right? So,
Right.
and thank you for bringing up the point from this person's comment. Like, we absolutely do need to have these conversations and this work, right? Like, conversations are to get things started, to spark
Yeah,
like
100%.
the work, but the work has to be done where we are addressing policies in our mosques, policies in our Islamic schools, in our youth groups, in centers where children are, in preteens are, when, you know, children are being called to the principal in Islamic schools for using certain language that, oh,
Mm-hmm.
like the non-Black Muslims who don't take racism against Black Muslims seriously are like, oh, well, they're just being kids, it's not that big of a deal. Whereas if you have been trained in anti-racism practices, you really do truly value inclusion and respect and dignity for all of the Muslims in your space, including our Black Muslim siblings in that space, you would take that language very, very seriously instead of just sweeping it under the rug.
100%. 100%. Yeah, no. Thank you for those in the comments. Yes, this has definitely been a very, very good conversation. I've definitely been enjoying. And yeah, I like the idea of expanding. I think this was good to have like a start, and I think we have a specific goal, which is to talk about anti-Black racism within the Americas. Of course, there's so much more conversations to have about anti-Black racism in the Muslim community all over the world.
But people in those contexts need to be able to be the
Right.
ones to lead that, because they're the ones who, like, one, are going to be taken seriously. Like, again, I'm born and raised in the United States. I like nationality wise, I'm American. Ethnically, I'm multi-ethnic. My mom is a like white convert to Islam, so mixed European ancestry, and my dad is an Iranian immigrant. So like, that is my context. No one from like an Arab country is going to see me with completely non-Arab background, like coming and criticizing them about anti-Black racism and be like, oh, we're going to listen to you. That's the whole point of allyship, right? Like, members of each other's community are more likely to listen, for unfortunately, but it is the case, right? Like, I really believe in separating the like what should be and what is, right? So like, there are moments where it is fine and good and like needed to vent about being frustrated about how the world works or how human brains work, or why can't we persuade people to change or get people to change or whatever. And like, we need time to vent about like, why won't they just listen to me? Like, as a Muslim woman wearing hijab, I might get frustrated about non-Muslims being Islamophobic, and I'm addressing that, but they're not as likely to listen to me talking about it. However, another non-Muslim speaking up and saying the literally same points, they are more likely, statistically, it is shown from research that they are more likely to listen.
100%. It's like super unfair that like a lot of non-Black Muslims are not willing to do the work of listening to the Black Muslim community.
Yeah.
It is completely unfair, but at the same time, I don't think it is the responsibility of Black Muslims to solve racism,
No.
right? Like, it is all
They're
of
just
our
existing. They're just living their lives.
Yeah, it's not their burden. Like, all of us have that role, which is why I think, again, I'm super grateful that you initiated this and reached out to me, and I'm honored to be here. And I do think it is 100% our responsibility to call, especially, like, again, like, as a South Asian person, calling out other South Asians, like, bro, like, that's not cool. And holding each other accountable within our own ethnic groups. Remembering that this is all of our responsibilities, and I don't have to be a Black person to call out your racism, right? Like, it is unjust, period. Like, regardless of what the social context is, you know, these behaviors, if they're harming other people, it's unfair. I get to call you out. I'm calling out as your sibling, and I'm calling in as well, right? Like, we have a conversation because we believe the Muslim community can do better. They are incredible. They're resilient. They have done so much, and they have the capacity to do better. And that is why we have this conversation, because we are optimistic, and we know our community has so much more, has so much more skills and potential.
Yeah, no, definitely. Absolutely. And I mean, honestly, like, and that's why we're having this conversation, doing more conversations, why I do the videos, and like, I want to expand, inshallah, in the future, doing more anti-racism and DEI as well, in general, work in Muslim specific spaces, inshallah, in the future. I don't have the capacity right now to focus on that. But this is so important because I know for myself, right, like Maliha, you mentioned earlier about privilege and using our privilege, right? Like, privilege is not, and this is something that comes up all the time in like non-Muslim DEI conversations around like white people or men or people of other like privileged dominant identities feeling like, oh, shame and guilt about whatever privilege that they might have, or, you know, worse, like just ignoring it, or it's like, no, that's stupid, reverse racism, blah, 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 blah. I was poor, so I can't possibly be privileged, whatever. Like, deflecting or just feeling so much shame that it paralyzes them. Like, that's not constructive. The point isn't to feel like bad for existing as someone with lighter skin, or someone with like who's a man, or someone who is able-bodied, or someone who is neurotypical, or whatever other identity groups that are like the privileged dominant identity. It's not that inherently just existing, being born as who you are is bad. Like, that's not the point, right? Point is that because of the systems and structures of our world from a sociological standpoint that exist, you are by default then given advantages and don't face barriers. So either you have a push, or you just don't have barriers in your way when you try and advance in life. So it's like a combination, depends on the context, that you have to experience, so that if you do actually examine and hold space for your privileges, again, not being shamed into like you existing as who you are, right? Like, I'm a very pale skinned person with hazel eyes, like, and I mention that because I do realize, especially coming on video or anytime someone talks to me in person, and I know like this, I hope this doesn't sound, you know, like, I don't know, arrogant or anything like that, but I am very aware that my eye color is a huge privilege, and people will stop and watch my videos purely because they're like, oh, someone with like non-brown eyes, or someone, I've had many people comment in real life on like, oh, wow, your eyes, I'm sorry, like, just like, in reality, like, people have said like, oh, your eyes are very pretty. And so for me, like, one, Islamically, like, trying to be like, stay humble and be appreciative. And again, like, this is not something that I'm a better person because of someone with brown eyes. Like, this is colorism. Like, this is racism because there's this favoring of like lighter white European, like Eurocentric features, right? And it's literally nothing about me. I just literally was born this way, right? But because I recognize that that is a privilege that I have, it's not like, oh, I'm never going to be on camera, or I'm just going to apologize or not acknowledge that this is a thing. It's about, okay, I acknowledge that this is a thing, and how can I use it as a tool for justice so that I can uplift the parts of my community as Muslims, like the darker skinned Muslims or Black Muslims, whatever the case may be of their ethnic or racial identity, so that they can then be treated with as much dignity as respect as I am, for literally no reason, just because I happen to exist in this flesh suit.
Yeah, no, 100%. Thank you again. Thank you all.
We're at time.
Because we're at time.
I want to respect your time because you're on East Coast time and it's later, and it's like your Friday night, and like maybe you want to do something other than this. So thank you all, alhamdulillah, so much, Maliha, for being here and sharing your experience and expertise and holding space for this. Thank you to everyone who came and participated and commented or watched or whatever, shared the live. If possible, I'm going to try, no guarantee, to repost this onto YouTube. So if anyone misses this, we can watch it back later. But if this is interesting, let me know. And we can continue having these conversations, because this is like literally just the very, very tip of the iceberg.